Edinburgh is today renowned for its architectural splendour, but it wasn't always so. For it was once a filthy, overcrowded city, its people choked by the smoke from chimneys. Long ago the boundaries for new houses were defined by its town walls, and so tenements rose and rose to towering heights. Here, both the poor and well-to-do were crammed into the same buildings, but the former occupied basement vaults and garrets. The rich, living in lofty eyries, didn't have to suffer the foul air of the dirty warren of streets below. The 19th century saw upheaval for Edinburgh as its inhabitants swelled with provincials fleeing rural hardship for work in the city's industries. In time, the rich were attracted to live in grand townhouses constructed in the new town, but poor families remained, living in single-room dwellings subdivided within the cramped old town tenements. These were dark and damp hovels, where unsanitary conditions allowed disease to run rife and the rate of mortality to spiral. Isabella Bird, 1831 to 1904, was a remarkable English lady in Victorian society, and her life is worthy of a story itself. The daughter of a priest, she was a keen traveller and writer, visiting many countries from America to the Far East. Bird discovered Scotland in the 1850s when her family took her north to improve her poor health with rural fresh air. She was later to find home in Edinburgh, where she met her husband. She faced constant dangers on her expeditions and, in the 1860s, visited Edinburgh's slum to report the dreadful sights she witnessed, with, no doubt, the same resolve. In previous videos, we took a trip with Isabella Bird into the old town as she began her investigations into Edinburgh's slums, discovering the horrid life children endured and how even obtaining water was a struggle for inhabitants. Today, we continue in her company, and as she travels from one close to another and from room to room, you will think that the sickening poverty she describes to us can surely get no worse. And yet she uncovers people living in filth and degradation, so shocking as to be scarcely believable. Families living in darkness, heaps of rubbish and human waste on floors of living quarters, enormous holes in rotting floors, drunkards kicking your doors through, and the likelihood of a brothel next door are but a few of the experiences waiting for you, should you have chosen, or more likely be forced through no other choice, to rent a room in a tenement from a landlord who couldn't care less if your child fell to their death on dilapidated stairs or your mother died of fever from the pestilent air of a miserably ventilated hovel, so long as they collected their money. This is but an example of the depravity and disgusting conditions you are about to discover in Edinburgh's old town slum during the 1860s. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. The smell of the close we visited was intolerable. How can it be otherwise when all the solid and liquid refuse which has been accumulating in the densely packed habitations during the day lies in the narrow close from 10 at night in such quantities that the scavengers not infrequently remove nearly a ton of it at 7 in the morning, and the ground and the foundations of the houses are saturated with the liquid refuse and drainage. I only give a sketch of the general conformation and circumstances of the lands in this close, premising that the description, often very much darkened in tint, however, applies to a majority of the old town abodes which, in Edinburgh, are considered good property and fit for the stowage of human beings. In Murdoch's Close, Hume's Close, Skinner's Close, Hindford's Close, South Follis Close, Cant's Close, Blackfriars Wynd, Todrick's Wynd, Plainstone Close, Campbell's Close, Brown's Close, etc., to which citizens who take an interest in this painful subject can add various other closes on both sides of the High Street and Canongate, many stairs in the Cowgate, and various entries and closes in the Grass Market and Westport. It is supposed that not fewer than 40,000 people live in habitations not superior to, and often much inferior to, the lands hereafter described. The entrance to the first land visited was by a very long, narrow, winding stair, with steps so worn as to be unsafe. The stair was as dark by day as by night until near the top, and there was nothing to assist an unsteady walker in his ascent or descent. The wall was broken, and, as we found on striking a light, the cracks swarmed with bugs and other vermin, as, indeed, does every fissure and cranny of the dilapidated tenements above. We had not gone far before the stench which assailed us was worse than that from the worst-kept pigsty, and we found the state of the stair too disgusting for description. It is disgraceful, degrading, shameful. And who is to blame? A stranger at once supposes that it is due partly to the filthy habits of the people, and also to the crime of the landlords in not lighting the stairs. This last is a criminal act as regards cleanliness, morals, and safety, and its continuance ought not to be permitted for another month. The regulation concerning the cleaning of the stairs cannot be carried out in the dark, even if the people had brooms, which most of them have not, and if they had a spigot in the close, instead of having to haul every drop of water from a public well at some distance. There is an infinite injustice and degradation in such a mode of access and egress for frail old age, and infancy scarcely less frail, for females heavily laden with water or refuse buckets, for young girls, and for men savagely or boisterously drunk, in many cases for a population over 200. On each landing there was a passage branching into several smaller ones, very much like the galleries in a coal pit, burrowing in and out among endlessly subdivided rooms, measuring from 18 feet by 10 feet to 9 feet by 5 feet, separated by skeleton partitions filled up with plaster, through which any man can put his foot. In this case the long passage was outside the congeries of habitations, and was lighted on 2 floors by the windows of the recesses, as having been the oratories of past generations. They had served the greed of late proprietors, for a great number of the rooms partitioned off from the passage were dimly lighted by windows looking upon it. Ventilated they could not be, for the smell in this passage was poisonous. Nothing shows more forcibly the lapsing of houses, as well as of human beings, than the fact that these recesses, once prized as places for prayer, are now highly valued for another purpose, being receptacles during the day for multitudes of battered pails, containing the ashes and refuse hourly accumulating in the rooms. Those persons consider themselves well off who have any such public recesses or corners which can be used for this purpose. In general, in these tenements, the inhabitants are compelled to keep the pail and bucket containing the unwholesome accumulations of the day under the bed, if there be one, and, failing that, in any corner, from 7 in the morning till 10 at night. In large young families, and in sickness and old age, the result may be imagined, when these accumulations of refuse of all descriptions are shut up in rooms without ventilation, along with the steam of half-washed clothes, in air contaminated by the respiration of several persons. In this land, the average size of the rooms is 12 feet by 7 feet. If on the one hand, drink brings people into these abodes, on the other, the foul, vile, depressing air, joined to the want of light and water, drives them in thousands to the dram shop. There was scarcely a woman whose face did not testify, by its depression, yellowness, and emaciation, to the air she is compelled to breathe by day and night. Besides that, the absence of temporary receptacles for refuse is utterly disgusting and injurious to health. It inflicts sore toil on the women, who are more than sufficiently burdened with drawing water from the public wells. It is not a small thing for the mother of a family, or a frail old wife, to come down the dark, filthy stair late at night with the ash bucket, even if there be a window halfway down from which she may discharge the contents onto the pavement below. All along the passages there were thin partitions stuffed with rags, where the plaster had fallen out, or had been kicked through in some drunken frenzy, doors so broken all round that privacy, even from the gaze of passing strangers, is impossible. A roof, in part, nothing better than old boards, strengthened with pieces of iron and tin, which, like everything else here, had seen better days. Floors rotten, so rotten as to require big stones to fill up holes larger than a man's head. Windows with hardly any glass left in them, wind and rain coming in many places. The whole pile apparently little more than just holding together by sheer force of habit, utterly unfit for human habitation, as it is a disgrace which public opinion ought to be strong enough to condemn. But it is one of a legion of similar disgraces. It is a lucrative sin, a paying shame, in politer language. It is a good investment. Aye, a good investment, for these cabins which by a pernicious fiction are called houses, are rack-rented at from £2, 10 shillings to £5 each, and pay the fortunate proprietors from 40 to 60%. Here are vested interests with a vengeance. This rickety land is not by any means in one of the worst closes in Edinburgh. It is not a haunt of the criminal classes. Vice and virtue live side by side, though the virtuous are in a miserable minority, and their children are in grievous peril of vice. I was given to understand by those well acquainted with the city that it was a good representative specimen of an average land in a high street close. On that and another occasion we visited 32 families, going by room row. I proposed to give the circumstances of a few families, taken after this fashion. All the rooms were in themselves wretched, few more than half lighted, scarcely any capable of ventilation, some on the second floor requiring candles at midday, floors and partitions in a shameful condition, the former in many instances containing holes as big as a man's head, stuffed with stones, the latter very thin and dilapidated, mended with rags, bits of canvas, tin, and paper. The doors were usually made of odds and ends of old boards, so rudely put together that in some rooms the people had nailed canvas over them to prevent strangers from looking in. The windows were nearly all bad and patched with brown paper. No gas or water. The landlord had never repaired anything within the memory of the oldest inhabitant. Among all the people visited, the complaints were the same. Rapacious landlords, charging from £2, 10 shillings to £5. No repairs executed. Borrowed light, involving an addition to the rent in the shape of 1 shilling per week for candles. Want of privacy. Distance of water supply. Dark stairs, increasing subdivision of rooms, involving, in some cases, the intense hardship of a right-of-way through the outer room. It is due to all these people to say that while they readily answered all our questions, they never begged of us, or even hinted that charity would be acceptable. It is due to some of them also to say that their attempts to keep their wretched dwellings clean were most praiseworthy. First room, 11 feet by 5 feet. A box bed took up a third of it. No grate, fire burning on a stone. The furniture consisted of the bed, a table with 3 legs, and a creepy, a traditional stool. The room had direct light from a small patched window, which was not made to open. The walls were broken and almost to pieces. There was a hole in the floor filled up with a large stone. The occupier, a mason's labourer, was out seeking work, and his wife was at the well. These 2 adults and 5 children between 3 and 14 years old slept on the floor. The eldest child said, "But don't your father and mother sleep on the bed?" we asked. "No, they can't for the bugs. We just lies on the floor, all of a heap." "In your clothes?" "No, we takes them off." "Do you put anything on?" "No, we's just naked." Truly, they had nothing to put on, if they did succeed in getting out of the wonderful aggregation of rags which hung on to them, for there were no blankets, or any covering but an old piece of carpet. The rent was £3, 10 shillings a year. The girl who made this frank revelation was extremely pretty and intelligent. Her young brother and sisters were beautiful, but absolutely filthy. Their arms and legs were covered with sores and their matted hair alive with vermin. The father was the only one of the family who could read. The girl said that her father's leg had gone through the floor up to the knee, and then they put the stone in the hole. From this account it appears that, after deducting the space occupied by the bed, 7 individuals huddled together all of a heap in an area 6 feet by 5 feet. The room was damp and draughty. The next room was 18 feet by 10 feet, shamefully out of repair, the wooden partition falling to pieces. Some of the holes in it were carefully patched with paper, but the neighbours constantly tear this off to look in. One of the so-called panels of the door had been kicked in by a drunken man. The landlord would not repair it, so the occupant had nailed a piece of canvas over it. The window glass was mostly gone, and though the window had originally been made to open, the sash was too rotten to be touched. The floor was in holes in several places. The rain came in along one wall. The rent is £4. The family consisted of an elderly father and mother and 2 sons, plumbers. The father and eldest son had been out of work for some time, and the youngest was only getting better from a fever. They were very reticent about their circumstances, but we gathered that 2 daughters in service were supporting them. Both father and mother were rheumatic from the damp of the house, they said. There were 2 beds, but they can't sleep on either, alive with bugs from the walls. So take refuge on the floor. The woman pulled aside a patch of canvas and showed the walls swarming with these pests. They had taken every means of destroying them, but in vain. The room was scrupulously clean. The next measured 11 feet by 5, and 6 feet at the highest part. A single pane of glass in a corner under the roof let in as much light as made objects discernible. The punishings, furniture, consisted of a filthy straw bed, a bit of carpet, and an iron pot. The floor was almost covered with cinders, and mended in 3 places with stones. The room was loathsome, the smell overpowering, the look of abject and uncared-for misery sickening. The occupants were a widow, a cinder-picker, and her 2 children, very poor. The children were learning the devil's lessons in the close below. A neighbour told us that the mother often locks them into the room from 5 o'clock in the morning till 10 or 11 at night. The rent is £2, 12 shillings. The next room was a house of ill fame, a brothel, with 7 occupants, very disorderly, and much complained of by the neighbours on each side, who were separated from it only by a wretched partition. The next room was almost dark, 11 feet by 5 feet, rent 1 shilling per week. Its sole occupant was a frightful-looking hag, apparently more than 70 years old, a mass of rags and filth with an uncovered hoary head, whose long locks were tangled with neglect and dirt. She was sleeping off the effects of a drunken debauch on some old straw, but woke up sufficiently to mutter a curse and glower upon us a moment with her bloodshot eyes. She had received the parish allowance the day before, and this was the result of a whisky bottle, without a cork, but not quite empty, was lying beside her. There was no other sign of human habitation, and in the wretched object lying on the straw we could hardly recognize humanity. Our next visit was of a different kind. Reaching the topmost floor, we came upon a passage, very dilapidated, but lighted by a large projecting window. A very respectable artisan was lime-washing the passage, the roof, and the top of the stair. He said it was the best he could do, and he did it once a fortnight. He had 2 rooms, only one of which had direct light. They were like all the rest, in utter disrepair. He leant against the outer partition, which swerved considerably from the perpendicular as he did so, and said, "The weight of 2 men would bring it down." He came to a situation in Edinburgh, has good wages, and could meet with nothing better than this at the term. The rent is £9 a year. He gave a revolting account of the immorality of the stair. He had 3 young children, he said. If he couldn't get into a decent neighbourhood, he'd rather see them in their graves than grow up there. What can I hope for my bairns, he added, when they can't get a breath of fresh air without seeing such as yon? Looking out, we saw in a window, not a pistol shot off, 3 debased women, sitting in the broad daylight, absolutely nude, as far as we could see of them. The worthy citizens who were with me blushed for the city called so fair, in which an honest artisan, with money in his pocket, was compelled to shelter his family where all sights and sounds were polluting, feeling, as he did, the abhorrent shame. The top of the stair was much broken, and destitute of any protection. A fall would have been into about 40 feet of darkness. On our alluding to this as a great peril for the young children, the man said, with a bitter smile, "Bairns reared in such places are like lambs born among precipices. They early learn to take care of themselves." This is true, or the juvenile population of these closes would be decimated. Of the sad sights we saw that morning, that was about the saddest. The honest man and his shame, and the helplessness of his circumstances. It was enough to make even polite indifference put forth some redeeming effort. First room on 5th floor, 12 by 14 feet. Rent, £2 10 shillings. Very cold. Roof out of repair and admitting rain. The partitions much broken. The occupiers were a very decent-looking man, 76 years old, by trade a shoemaker, his wife, aged 73, and a dumb grandson who was mending a shoe on the stool on which his grandfather had sat for 62 years. They had parish relief. The woman had been in bed 12 months with paralysis and suffered much from being removed. The dirt and vermin were perfectly awful. She was a miserable object. Apparently she had no bedgown, and her skeleton chest and ribs, which were exposed to view, might have served as a model for death. Both she and her husband had the speech and air of having seen better days. They had lived in this attic for 20 years, and had had typhus fever twice during the last 10. The rent had been raised £1 during the same period. They had 5 children, scattered in Australia and America, but letters addressed to them were returned with a notice, "Not found." They seemed very poor, but made no complaint of anything but the wretched condition of the room, the cold and damp, the want of privacy, and the distance from which the old man had to bring the water up the long dark stair. The room was clean, with the exception of the bed, but the cracks in the partitions there, as everywhere else, were alive with bugs. The old man said he was a church member, and paid 2 shillings 6 a year for a seat at a UP church. This was their own account of themselves, and the general appearance of things bore it out. Such are the cases in which much may be done by systematic visitation in the way of arresting a downward course. These people are now in the poorhouse, the dram shop having proved too much for the old man. Next room. A blind labourer, very frail, with a wife, who supports the family and 4 children. After an illness, were ordered into the poorhouse, then out again, and were quite broken up by it. This room was wretched in every respect, 9 feet by 10 feet, very low, and rented at £2. In the next room there was a very sad case, a compositor, a person who arranges type for printing, with a wife and 2 children, living in a room requiring a candle at midday, 12 feet by 8 feet, roof mended with tin, letting in the rain, floor broken and mended with stones, so rotten that a walking stick went through it in 2 places. The man's joints were stiff with rheumatism, caught in the damp cold of the room. Work had slackened, and after having had a good room in Carriber's Close, they had come here. The man had had no work for a long time, and they had pledged everything, till they had only the clothes they stood in. They had had good furniture, but it was all gone to keep life in them. They spoke of their poverty very reluctantly, and very warmly of the kindness of the missionary. Both man and wife were steady. Her earnings supported them, but she was expecting her confinement, childbirth, shortly. The next room was 14 feet by 8 feet, and the remains of a cornice held onto the outer wall. The side walls were skeleton partitions, dilapidated and swarming with bugs. There were 3 doors. The occupant was a fish hawker, an Irish woman, cheery and self-asserting, voluble as to herself and her neighbours. Had she been of smaller size and milder tongue, the hardship of which she complained would have had more pathos about it. But even as it is, a more infamous injustice could scarcely be perpetrated by the proprietors of these ruinous fabrics. Her room had been subdivided since she came. She continued to pay the old rent, £4. The occupants of the inner room were a man and a woman, with 2 lodgers, apparently of most irregular habits, who came through her room with a pass-key, drunk and sober at all hours of day and night. This is one of 11 instances of passage rooms that I have seen in Edinburgh. In the Cowgate, this infamous system flourishes, and occasionally to such an extent that the outer room is the only mode of ingress and egress for 3 or 4 others. The insult and hardship this plan entails upon the virtuous, and the facilities for immorality that it affords to the vicious, cannot be recited here. Outside this woman's room, there was a perfect labyrinth of passages, all dark, but on opening a door we entered a room 12 feet square, with direct light, but with rotten partitions, like all the rest, and so pervious to sound that we heard every word of a narrative of our visit, which the decent widder before mentioned was giving to an incomer. This room was miserable, ashes, the accumulation of days heaped on the floor round the fire. There was no other furniture than a bedstead with a straw mattress upon it, a table and a stool, but it was the occupants, rather than the apparent poverty, who claimed our attention. A girl about 18, very poorly dressed, was sitting on the stool. 2 others, older and very much underdressed, were sitting on the floor, and the 3 were eating, in most swinish fashion, out of a large black pot containing fish. I have shared a similar meal in a similar primitive fashion, in an Indian wigwam in the Hudson's Bay territory, but there the women who worshipped the Great Spirit were modest in their dress and manner, and looked human, which these Christian young women did not. An infant of about a month old, perfect in its beauty, and smiling in its sleep, as though heaven lay about it, was on the bed, not dressed, but partly covered with a rug. What better could be desired for it than the angels might take it speedily away from that shameful birth-chamber to behold its Father's face in heaven? Easier by far to trust it in death to his mercy than in life to the zeal of the Christianity of Edinburgh. Death for these is better than life, and, in many cases, drugs and neglect soon bring it about. "Where are you from?" one of my philanthropic companions asked of the girl of 18, the mother. "Dundee. Mother and I came here 5 weeks ago. I was a mill worker." "Will the father of your child marry you?" "No, sir." "Have you got work here?" "No, sir, I can't get any." "What are you going to do, then?" "I suppose I must do as the others." She gave this answer without shame and without effrontery, an upbringing in a Dundee penned, a passageway through a building, had not acquainted her with shame as an attendant upon sin. Alas for the hundreds of girl children growing up among the debasing circumstances of the crowded lands of our wines and closes, without even the instincts of virtue. The next room, though miserable in itself, was clean and well furnished, with pictures hanging upon the partitions, a mother and daughter, both widows, but earning a good living by needlework, were the occupants. They complained bitterly of the gross viciousness of the stair and of the awful riot kept up all night by those newcomers. They told us that the wretched old hag who had come from Dundee had 5 female lodgers, with only 2 gowns among them all, and that they were of the poorest and most degraded class. These respectable widows, both elderly women, had lived in that room for 7 years, and in the main had had quiet neighbours. They now found themselves in this close proximity to a den of vice, unable to exclude the sounds which came through the thin partition, and too terrified at night by the drinking and uproar to be able to sleep. The term was lately past, so they were compelled to bear it. A few sentences more will take us through the remaining rooms on the 2 floors we are investigating. There follow a widow who binds shoes, with 2 children, sleeping in a large bed in a room 11 feet by 9 feet, with a small window letting in air too impure to breathe. Rent £2 12 shillings. A widow with a brother 72 years old, poor but clean, chiefly dependent on a daughter in service. A mason's labourer who once farmed 6 acres of land, now earns 12 shillings per week. Wife with bad eyes and health too delicate for work, having fretted herself into decline for 2 children who had died of the cholera. Room 12 feet by 8 feet, rented at 1 shilling 2 pence per week. 3 adults and 6 children in a room 12 feet by 10 feet, without direct light. Drunken labourer, earning 15 shillings per week, 2 sons in prison, 2 daughters living with him, with 3 illegitimate children. Room 14 feet by 15 feet. Rent £3 18 shillings a year. Pauper widow, with 1 child and 2 unregistered lodgers. Married labourer with 2 children, earning 15 shillings per week. 3 lodgers, prostitutes, in the same room. 14 feet by 12 feet. Rent £3 18 shillings. Borrowed light, no furniture, all drunken together. Then follow 5 families, all wretched, and we have completed our room-to-room visitation of 2 floors in an average land in an average close in the High Street. As seen thus, in broad daylight, except for the filth, dilapidation, vermin, darkness and poverty, combined with the suggestions of immoral conduct on the part of most of the people, there was nothing peculiarly startling to anyone at all acquainted with the old town of Edinburgh. I have taken this particular close for the especial reason that what is said of it and its inhabitants applies to dwellings and circumstances in which possibly 40,000 people pass their days. I have given the impression made by it upon a stranger, in preference to depicting entries in a part of the town with which I am well acquainted, and which, in many of their aspects, are far worse. There are cellar dwellings, damp and dark, old byres with open drains still running through them, let for human beings, garrets, damp and draughty, in which a man can scarcely stand upright, and cabins, of which stairs, roofs, and walls are mainly of wood. There are rooms as small as any I have mentioned, occupied by 1, 2, and 3 families, only reached by passage rooms, as small and crowded as themselves, and in these dens the whole round of human life goes on. Agonies of birth and death, miseries of sickness and sorrow, marriage jollifications, funeral revels, the cold remains of mortality, lying on the same straw with the living, the miserable meal on the table, the unshrouded corpse on the floor. Are such woes as these, such absolute savage degradation, the inevitable deposit of the highest Christian civilization? Are the rich and godly to send missionaries and Bible women among these masses, and save their own souls by giving the necessary funds? Shall they not rather go down themselves among the lost, as Christ went, and learn their needs, and find from themselves that foremost among these are decent dwellings in which it might be possible to live and die otherwise than as swine? We might then hear less of money lying at 2% in the banks or lost in insolvent railroads, and more of 8, 10, and 12% as a certain return. Talk of the risk of house property. Is it greater than the risks people have contentedly run for years in railroads, mines, and cotton? Possibly every £100 spent on improving the dwellings of the poor might do something towards accumulating a treasure in the heavens that faileth not, where no thief approacheth, or moth corrupteth. The walls of the old town houses are generally strong. Such a land as that which I have described, gutted from cellar to roof, and supplied with water, gas, and temporary receptacle for rubbish, would make a good substantial house at a comparatively small cost, with a certain return of from 8 to 10%. The removal of the subdividing partitions, new floors, doors, and windows would be a necessity. The good result of such an undertaking in every close and wind would not only be the placing of 16 or 18 families in a position in which, if they were so minded, they could be moral and religious, but the insertion of a wedge into this hardened stratum of viciousness and poverty. The bad could not be so bad in close proximity to the virtuous. The filthy would aspire to be something better. The landlords, the hardest class of all to deal with, would be compelled by competition and opinion to amend their property and their ways. Decent houses in St. Bernard's or St. Leonard's have no more influence over the manners and morals of Hume's Close or Todrick's Wynd than decent houses in Moray Place or Chester Street. But decent lands put down in Cant's Close or Skinner's Close, with rooms rented from £2, 10 shillings to £4, would do a better work of reformation around them than all the agencies which are at work.